frame a place for man's habitation. Thus began our American civilization. Now, Captain John Smith, our first writer of American literature, had made himself somewhat famous in England before he came to the States. He could not hear of a fight going on anywhere in the world without hastening to be a part of it. Now, Smith was only 27 years old. I think about that. My grandson is 27 years old, and to have crossed the Atlantic, those 3 little ships, and to then land in basically a wilderness, and to write what he did. He was a champion of ladies. He was a man who furnished history with his exploits and never failed to celebrate himself as the one resplendent and invincible hero. This vivid, resolute man was the most conspicuous person in the first successful American colony. I'm going to read some of the things that he wrote. Actually, the very first book, A True Relation of Virginia, relates the very beginning of our national history. It was probably carried to London by Captain Nelson of the good ship Phoenix, which sailed from Jamestown a year later, a little over a year later, on June the 2nd, 1608. It was published in London and then sold in the latter part of 1608, that is, in England. In this book, Captain Smith describes the sea voyage, the arrival in Virginia, ungentle passages with the Indians, selection of place of settlement, organization, return to England, grumblings and mutterings. Captain Martin's illness presented problems. Captain Smith spared no pains in making houses for him. He was especially friendly with Powell and his daughter Pocahontas, who saved him. I'll talk about that a little more later. Smith's narratives have become the most famous and the only ones still widely read as literature from this early period. Now, he also wrote a book, a description of New England, which dates from 1616. And this is, he had a counterpart that was earlier in 1612, Map of Virginia, with a description of the country. But the one work that still today you see referred to was printed in 1624, and it's his Smith's General History. And that's the way she's referred to, but the full name is the General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles. So John Smith is one of those people that we are drawn to. He said, what their swords did, their pens writ. That's one of his quotations. He was a prolific writer, and nearly all of his books refer to America. And as I said, 3 of them we truly feel belong to our literature. I mentioned that the colonists, the English colonists, we're not talking about English like the Staines and or anything, but the 1607 landing in Jamestown and the 1620 at Plymouth, those in that period after 1620, there were no less than 10 other communities, with Pennsylvania being the last in 1681, the others being in this order. These are people who came from England, and they were the first group in Plymouth in 1620, then the New Hampshire group, then Massachusetts Bay in 1630, the Maryland, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute, Connecticut, Rhode Island, North Carolina, New York, New Jersey, and then South Carolina. You notice Georgia's not in that. Georgia's 1832, so that's after 1700, so we won't get into that. Our first literary period then fills the larger part of that 17th century. And in this first literary period, we see that American civilization had its planning, and these authors that I'm going to mention helped to record their view of what was happening and what was going on in this country. So it's without a doubt, in fact, we can date the exact date of American literature. Can you tell me the year? 1607, because immediately John Smith went to work and wrote these things. So the first whisperings of American literature were heard then along the banks of the Chesapeake and the James River. Now I'm going to quickly go over 5 men who were Virginians. I'm going to stick with Virginia right now, and then we'll move to New England. The first name I'll mention is George Percy. He was the brother of the great Earl of Northumberland, and he wrote of the gloom that descended along with the famine, fevers, deaths, and Indian hostility. He said God put a terror into savage judges' hearts, or all would have perished. George Percy of Northumberland was a man who had a brightness in his sketches of the bloom of their first year in America. The second one I'm going to mention came in May of 1610 when Sir Thomas Case arrived after a very difficult crossing across the Atlantic. The man's name is William Strachey. There were 9 ships in Gates' fleet, and they had a great deal of difficulty and experienced a great deal of peril. Strachey was a man of great aptitude. He was made Secretary of Virginia, and in less than 3 months after he arrived in May of 1610, he had written a little book of marvelous power, a description of the terrible sea voyage, the tempest, the terror and anguish of 1,000 deaths, and Indian uprisings and massacres. It's said that Shakespeare, and I checked the internet on this, that Shakespeare wrote his play, The Tempest, in either 1610 or 11, and it is believed that he may have seen description that Shakespeare's Tempest has overtones of suggestions that maybe he knew of William Strachey's writing of that terrible crossing of the Atlantic. The next one I'm going to mention kind of touches on our friend Mary Friend. Alexander Whitaker, who died in Virginia in 1616, was a man who was a devoted Christian missionary. And he came and there near Jamestown established, I don't know how to pronounce it, Enrico. Did they say Henrico or Enrico?
Henrico. Right.
Anyway, he established, it was a way to try to reach out to the Indians. He, in 1613, taught the catechism to Pocahontas. She could tell me all of this. And it is believed, though it's not confirmed, that 2 years later, in 1650, he performed the marriage of Pocahontas and John Law. Is that what you heard?
Yeah, that's consistent.
We look forward to your talk on Pocahontas. It's going to be exciting, I know. He wrote, that is Alexander Whitaker, Good News from Virginia. And this is the first book actually written on American soil, published in England in 1613. The next one I'm going to mention arrived here in 1619. So this is still prior to when the Plymouth Rock came. This gentleman's name is Master John Powell, who was 49 years of age, and he had been educated at Cambridge. He arrived as the new governor for Virginia. The new governor of Virginia was Sir George York that he arrived with. His style of writing was lively and sparkling. He had the gift of making friends in high places. He became a member of Parliament and was appointed Secretary of Virginia. However, some of the topics he talked about were amusing sketches of Indian character, the humors and constellations of pioneer life along the James River. So John Corey is another one. The last one that I'm going to mention is one who was in the States, in the colony of Virginia, for 10 years. He came in 1621 and departed in 1631. He was a very highly educated man. His name is George Sandys, Sandys. He, before, about the time he came to the Virginia shores, he had published a translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses from the Latin. And then he published another when he went back to England in 1631. And though he's known for his poetry also, that still stands out today. If you go to the internet and check him, he still is remembered for that translation of Ovid. And the 1632 version is still considered outstanding. He had hoped to become the colonial treasurer of the Virginia Company, and when he did not get it, he was disappointed. That's why he returned to England in 1631. Now, a few years after the departure of George Sandys, Virginia, a Roman Catholic nobleman, Lord Baltimore, who was the favorite of King Charles, obtained from King Charles, the choice portion of Virginia. This portion lay north of the Potomac, which Virginia, the colony, parted after a reluctant claim. Most of what was written about Maryland, see, when Maryland, this section was taken away from Virginia, most of this was written in the form of angry pamphlets